I rise to be a voice for the 3.5 million American citizens living in Puerto Rico, the 200,000 Puerto Ricans who served in our armed forces in every conflict since World War I, and the 20,000 who currently wear the uniform of the United States and put their lives on the line for our country. I rise to introduce a comprehensive stability and recovery package that restores fairness, ensures accountability, and gives Puerto Rico the tools it needs to dig itself out of this hole. And I rise to implore this Congress to act before it is too late. Let me thank Senators Schumer and Brown, Senators Warren, Cantwell, Blumenthal, and Booker for supporting these efforts and working so hard on behalf of the people of Puerto Rico. I also want to thank Congressman Pierluisi, who co-authored the tax sections of this bill, along with parts of the health care titles. And finally, I want to thank Governor Padilla for his incredible leadership on the island and for strongly endorsing our legislation. The people of Puerto Rico are fortunate to have a governor that cares deeply about their lives and is so dedicated to putting them first and above politics. Now, let me put it this bluntly. Puerto Rico is on the brink of default and staring into the abyss. For the better part of the past year, the government has been compelled to take drastic and unprecedented actions just to avoid a total default of the central government. They have closed schools and hospitals. They have laid off police officers and firefighters. They've raised taxes on businesses and individuals. But all the spending cuts and tax hikes in the world won't make a dent in this crisis unless Puerto Rico has the ability to restructure its debts. That's because just servicing the government's $72 billion debt is swallowing a massive 36% of the island's revenue. That's 36 cents of every dollar the government takes in going not to roads or bridges and schools, but bondholders instead. This percentage is 6 times the U.S. state average and simply unsustainable by any measure. In fact, despite all we hear about Puerto Rico's significant annual budget deficits, the island would actually be running a surplus if it didn't have to make debt payments. Let me repeat that. It would have a surplus. These debt service payments act like an albatross and handcuff the people of Puerto Rico, preventing them from investing in their economy. Less resources for education, for infrastructure, essential services causes a death spiral as talented workers opt to leave the island, businesses are shuttered, and revenue drops even further. That's why the first and most important step that we can take is to give Puerto Rico the ability to restructure its debt in an orderly fashion. A right that they had at one time and that was surreptitiously stripped out. There's no legislative history as to why it was stripped out, but they had this right. This is not novel. Our legislation would do, in essence, just that, providing a fair and reasonable way for Puerto Rico to restructure all of its debts while avoiding a costly race to the courthouse that would result in years of costly litigation. But before Puerto Rico can even access this authority, it needs to affirmatively opt in and accept the establishment of an independent fiscal stability and reform board and create a chief financial officer. This both ensures that any restructuring plan is based on objective and independent analysis of the island's situation and provides assurances to creditors that future governments will adhere to a prudent, long-term fiscal plan while affirming and respecting Puerto Rico's sovereignty. Once Puerto Rico opts in, it receives an automatic 12-month stay to give government officials the necessary breathing room to organize their finances and develop a sustainable 5-year fiscal plan upon which annual budgets and their restructuring proposal will be based. Once the governor submits a restructuring proposal, a judge selected by the First Circuit Court of Appeals would have to affirm it complies with the fiscal plan, protects the rights of pensioners, and if feasible, does not unduly impair general obligation bonds. Our process follows precedent by giving creditors a voice and their ability to object in court, and ultimately gives an independent judge the authority to ensure any plan is fair and reasonable. And in order to ensure the long-term fiscal plan is followed not just now, but in the future, our legislation gives the independent board the power to review annual budgets, future debt issuances, and exercise strong oversight and transparency powers. If future budgets do not comply with the fiscal plan, the board has the authority to issue a vote of no confidence, which will send a strong and unequivocal message to the legislature, to capital markets, and the Puerto Rican people that the proposed path is unsustainable, which in turn will provide much-needed transparency and accountability to the budgeting process. But at the same time, we are careful to affirm the fundamental pillars of democracy by making the board of, by, and for the people of Puerto Rico. The board will consist of 9 members chosen by the governor of Puerto Rico, its legislature, both parties, the Supreme Court, and the President of the United States. At least 6 of the board members must be full-time residents of Puerto Rico. At least 6 must have knowledge of its history, culture, and socioeconomics, and all members must have financial and management expertise. This structure strikes the proper balance by providing strong and independent oversight and accountability while still respecting the sovereignty and democratic rights of the people of Puerto Rico. It is not a bailout. Far from it, in fact. This proposal wouldn't cost the U.S. Treasury a penny, not a dime, because it is limited to the territories, wouldn't have a contagion effect on the broader municipal market. Now, as I have said before, giving Puerto Rico the flexibility to restructure its debt is the top priority and a prerequisite for any legitimate recovery plan. But it's also clear that the lack of health care funding parity is adding pressure to the overall financial situation, as the island's health care system accounts for 20% of the island's economy, and it's responsible for 1/3 of its overall debt burden. Currently, Puerto Rico's Medicaid program, rather than being reimbursed for necessary costs, is capped. And not only is it capped, it's set to hit a funding cliff as soon as mid-2017. And when it hits that cliff, what this happens, the island will instead receive funding to cover only a very small portion of its Medicaid costs, a burden no state could handle. Our legislation, the second piece of our legislation, fixes this by moving Puerto Rico towards a Medicaid system that provides stable funding for the long term. Additionally, there are several policies in Medicare that treat the island differently from the rest of the nation, leaving providers and seniors to face unfair penalties and lower reimbursements. This second bill eliminates many of these discrepancies to more accurately align Medicare policies in Puerto Rico with the rest of the country. And as citizens of the United States, and I emphasize that because sometimes I've had members of Congress have asked me whether they need an American passport to go to Puerto Rico. And I thought they were joking, but they were serious. As citizens of the United States, it's only fair that Puerto Ricans be afforded the same access to care, coverage, and health benefits as everyone else. Finally, our legislation would incentivize Puerto Rican workers to enter the formal economy and give families the help they need to raise their children by providing parity to the island for the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit. Praised by both Republicans and Democrats as one of the most effective tools to combat poverty and encourage workers to enter the labor market, the Earned Income Tax Credit is currently unavailable to the people of Puerto Rico. However, as American citizens, All it takes for a resident of Puerto Rico to become eligible for the credit is a short plane ride to Miami. This is just another reason why so many Puerto Ricans have fled the island and taken up residence in the mainland. It makes no sense to prohibit American citizens living in Puerto Rico from taking advantage of this important credit, especially with such a stubbornly lower labor participation rate. Our legislation corrects this inequity, providing equal treatment for all American citizens, regardless of whether they reside in Puerto Rico or in the States. Mr. President, I shouldn't need to remind this body that from the infancy of our nation, the people of Puerto Rico have been there for us and with us, and now we need to be there for them. Puerto Rico was ceded to the United States in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. Less than 2 decades later, in 1917, Congress passed the Jones-Shafroth Act, granting American citizenship to the residents of the island. But even long before they were granted U.S. citizenship, Puerto Ricans have had a long and profound history of fighting on the side of America. As far back as 1777, Puerto Rican ports were used by U.S. ships, enabling them to run British blockades and keep commerce flowing, which is so crucial to the war effort. It was Puerto Rican soldiers who took up arms in the U.S. Civil War, defending this nation's capital, Washington, D.C., from attack, and fought in the Battle of Fredericksburg. In World War I, almost 20,000 Puerto Ricans were drafted in the U.S. Armed Forces. And let's not forget about the 65th Infantry Regiment, known as the Borinquineros, the segregated military unit composed almost entirely of soldiers from Puerto Rico that played a crucial and prominent role in World War I, in World War II, and the Korean War. I'm proud to say that I worked with Senator Blumenthal and others to make sure that the heroic Borinquineros, the only active duty segregated Latino military unit in the history of the United States, and the last segregated unit to be deactivated, received well-deserved and long overdue national recognition when we passed the bill awarding these courageous patriots with a Congressional Gold Medal, the highest expression of national appreciation for distinguished achievements and contributions to the United States. So while some might be tempted to point their finger at our brothers and sisters on the island and for Puerto Rico for carrying more than $70 billion in debt, I challenge my Senate colleagues to work with us on finding solutions, because this problem isn't going away. Mark my words, if we don't act now, this crisis will explode into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe, not in a matter of decades or even years, but in months. In just a couple of months, they have a major payment that they do not have the wherewithal to make. And so we may think we will kick the ball down the road, but no, that human catastrophe is going to take place in months, and we'll be right back here next year with the same set of problems, only far, far worse. Delaying action is akin to letting an infection reach the bloodstream before seeking treatment. The longer you wait, the more painful and challenging the treatment is. Puerto Rico isn't asking us to pull them out of this. Just give them the wherewithal to help them help themselves be able to achieve the goal. Let's not stand aside and do nothing while the island burns. Let's not turn our backs on our friends and fellow citizens when they need us the most. Let's instead come together as a nation and support our fellow citizens like we always do when things get tough. The people of Puerto Rico have always been there for us and with us. Let us make sure that we're there for them. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.